Okay, welcome. So after our winter break, we will resume, and we are up to the 7th chapter of Rambam's Sefer HaMadah, the Book of Cognition, and Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the laws of the foundations of the Torah. So we're about to start a new topic, and it's the final topic in this part of the code, the topic of prophecy. Right, so far we've talked about knowledge of God's existence. We've talked about the prohibition of even considering the possibility of another divine being. We've talked about God's unity. We've talked about loving and fearing God. All of that was universal, applied to all human beings. Then the specifically Jewish mission was to sanctify God's name, and conversely not to profane God's name. And that had consequences both for giving up one's life in extreme circumstances, also for how one leads one's life, and then for how one treats scripture containing the name of God with respect. So now, the final fundamental to be dealt with is prophecy. Obviously, that is going to be of some importance, because without that we wouldn't have Judaism. We certainly would not have the Torah. So, I think the first thing we need to explain is that Rambam is operating here against the background of a considerable amount of theorizing about how prophecy works. And prophecy was understood by just about everybody to be a kind of knowledge. So all the philosophers, going back to the ancient Greeks, had some idea of how prophetic knowledge works. And the Rambam has an account of knowledge that seems to fit well with what his predecessors in the Arabic revival of Aristotelianism had said before. In particular, figures like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. There are some differences between those figures, but I don't think they're important for our purposes. What is important is how, in general, do the philosophers think prophecy works? And then what we'll see is that Rambam weaves that philosophical view together with what he finds in both Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and in the Talmud, and so on. Okay, so first of all, it's important to discuss Plato and Aristotle, what they agree on and what they disagree on, and the way in which the Arabic revival of Aristotelianism handled that disagreement. So what do they agree on? Well, let's start with a very basic fact about the world. For example, that this is a blue thing, and this is another blue thing. Right? So we have two things, and goodness knows how many more, that are blue. So different things, but they have the same property. So the question is, in virtue of what do they have the same property? What does it mean to say they have the same property? So what Plato and Aristotle agree on is that there is some one thing in virtue of which they have these distinct properties. Call it a universal property or something that's shareable. But how does that work? Well, for Plato, that there must be one exemplary, perfect blueness beyond this world of change and individuality. There's this one universal blueness. And all the blue things down here have blueness in virtue of their relationship to that form of blueness up there. And even if all the blue things on Earth were to be obliterated, that perfect blueness would still exist. That's the Platonic view, Plato's theory of the forms. Aristotle has a hard time with the idea of perfect blueness that totally transcends the world. Instead, he thinks that there are forms, but they are distributed among the particular things that have the properties. So each blue thing will also have, in addition to just having the property blue, it has some sort of form that is immanent within it, in virtue of which it has blueness. And it does seem on that view anyway, that if all of the blue things on Earth were obliterated, there wouldn't be any blueness left. It would appear to be the case, because blueness does not exist separately on this view. Forms are immanent in things that are made up of form and matter. And we've already met Aristotle's theory of hylomorphism, that things here on Earth are composed of form and matter. Okay, so that's the disagreement, big disagreement between Plato and Aristotle. Plato thinks the forms exist separately and transcendently. Aristotle thinks they exist immanently and within hylomorphic substances. Now, by the time Rambam and other people reading these texts in Arabic receive the tradition, they have a complicated history that precedes them. And they don't have the exact texts of Aristotle the way that we have them now. They weren't reading Greek directly, they're reading translations. They have other works that are attributed to Aristotle, which we would now say are not by Aristotle. And they have a long history of interpretation. And in particular, what's called the Neoplatonist school. They didn't call themselves Neoplatonists, I think that's a 19th century term, emphasized the ways in which Plato and Aristotle really agree. That in many ways they agree more than they disagree. So from the Neoplatonic school, we get the following idea, which was read into Aristotle. I'm not going to get into the details. It has to do with a passage in Aristotle's De Anima, Treatise of the Soul, Book 3, Section 5. It doesn't matter for our purposes, but they thought this was actually in Aristotle. And the view is that from God emanates or overflows the separate intellect, which is pure form thinking itself. From that emanates yet another intellect, which is not quite as elevated in its level. It's further removed from divinity. And from that, yet another intellect, and so on, until we have a total of 10. Nothing about that in any book of Aristotle that we know. But that's what the Neoplatonists thought, and it's what the Arabic Aristotelians thought was Aristotelian. These intellects play an important role, not only with respect to their relationship upwards towards God, but downwards as well. The last of the separate intellects is the one that is closest to our Earth, the sublunar realm, the realm below the moon. And that last intellect, think of it as a sort of transmitter of form, right? So everything, in other words, has this overflow. Form that thinks itself is a kind of perfection and generosity. And the higher intellects generate other intellects. But the lowest one generates not intellect exactly, but form that is then implemented and materialized or realized in our world. So that last active intellect, as it is called, is what is responsible for the form of hylomorphic substances here on Earth. Now, there's a similar disagreement about knowledge to the one that there is about reality between the Platonists and the Aristotelians. If you're a Platonist, then you would aspire to have direct knowledge of the separate forms. If you could bypass this world and the sensible things within it that are known through the senses and go straight to the separate forms, that would be great. Very hard to do that. It's a question whether we can, but that would be the aspiration. The Aristotelian rejects that idea and says, no, you have to know forms from the things that have the forms. So you have to start with your senses and only then work up to an abstraction of form from the hylomorphic things on Earth. But in the Arabic Aristotelian tradition, there's a third option. in general, like good Aristotelians, we should start with our senses. We should try to know the physical world by means of our senses, try to develop more abstract concepts, and so on. That is the way of physics. But if someone gets accomplished enough at understanding these forms, they will find, under the right conditions, that they tune in, as it were, directly to the active intellect itself. Right? So remember, the active intellect is think of it as like a radio transmitter. It's transmitting the forms. So you can know the forms as they are once they're transmitted. But if you could actually tune in to the transmission itself, that would be even better. So within Arabic Aristotelianism, there's something a bit more like Platonism, a way of directly knowing the forms in the intellect, separate from the transmitted forms here on earth. Those people would be prophets, right? Because they would have an intuitive understanding that couldn't even be expressed in human language directly. Because what we can express is what our language is made for. Our language is made for the stuff that we see and feel and hear and touch and smell around us. And it's very good for that. But if you're talking about expressing in human language a form, as it is separate from anything sensible or physical, that would be difficult or impossible to do. So it's intuitive, it's not conceptual. But they would also understand, such people would understand much more about the world. They would know something about what's going to happen in the future because they understand the way the basic laws of the universe really work. The basic laws are the laws of form. They might not be able to explain to us how they know it, but they would know it. So that's the background here. Those are the prophets. People who succeed in achieving union with the active intellect that transmits form to this created world of ours. And that's the picture of revelation that Rambam operates with. So it's a little different from many other conceptions of revelation. It's not clear in particular that there's any idea here that God is speaking to a certain person. Right? It's not so much addressed. It's rather that this transmission of form is going on all the time, but we are not tuned into it. So we have to tune into that. Yes.
But when God says to Avram, directly, Avram, and he says, Hineni.
Yes.
So how do you deal with that? Because that's a direct transmission to him.
Right. So the two possibilities. One is
if any prophet could hear that, then it's not being directed to that.
Right. So I don't know. I don't think Rambam has too much to say about the aspect of speech or thought that I would call address. But the occasion when somebody succeeds in tuning in, that one can say something about. Now, one big issue among the philosophers, and Rambam talks about this at some length in the Guide to the Perplexed, is whether prophecy is entirely natural or involves another element. Call it the will of God. In other words, is it the case that just like any other kind of knowledge, you've tried to satisfy certain conditions, and if you satisfy those conditions, you have knowledge? Is it like that with prophecy? Try to satisfy the conditions, and if you do, then you're a prophet. So the Rambam's way of dealing with that is to say we can steer between two extremes. Okay. So here is an extreme view. Extreme view would be prophecy depends only on God's will. God can pick anybody, can pick an idiot and give them revelation. That would be an extreme view. Rambam rejects it. We don't pick idiots to be prophets. There are going to be conditions, which we'll talk about. Another extreme view is the one I mentioned before, which is it's totally natural. and if you satisfy the conditions, you automatically become a prophet. Rambam says there's a way in between. You have to satisfy conditions, but even then, God could refuse you prophecy. So that's where divine will comes into it, right? It is in, as it were, not refraining from refusing you prophecy. So in the case of Abraham being addressed, I think the way to understand that is that Abraham satisfies the conditions. There's something special about the occasion, because as we'll see in a minute, with one exception of Moshe, the prophets do not prophesy all the time. Right. It only happens under very specific circumstances. Right? The circumstances are right, and then God does not refrain from refusing Abraham prophecy. But again, I think that's very different from a picture of some kind of directed speech or something like that. Okay, so and that will lead us to a further question, which we may get to today, but we certainly will next time, which is the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu, the prophecy of Moses. Right, so Rambam is very careful to distinguish the prophecy of Moses from everybody else. He needs that because if it's going to be a law-based religion, which is very much what he believes in, then there has to be some sort of authoritative basis. And obviously a religion that is based on revelation is in principle open to complete chaos and anarchy. Everybody could claim prophecy and they could say this thing, they could say that thing, right? So we don't want a system like that. Instead, we have one supreme prophet, and he'll talk about how that works and how it's reflected in the biblical passages. And then there's the prophecy of everybody else. So most of what he says in this section is about everybody else. And then the 8th chapter will be about Moshe. But even here, he's going to have one halacha where he talks about Moshe and that he's not like all the others. Okay, so let's look on page 2 of the handout. And I've got each of the sections here with a translation. Yeah. Okay, so Yesodei HaTorah. It's one of the basic principles of religion, Leida, to know that God inspires men with the prophetic gift. He causes human beings to prophesy. Ve'ein hanevua chala ela al chacham gadol b'chachma gibor b'midosov v'lo yehe yitzro miskaber olav b'dova ba'olam elahu miskaber b'da'ato al yitzro tamid. And the spirit of prophecy only rests upon the wise man, so that's the first condition, who's distinguished by great wisdom, and strong moral character, that's the second condition, whose passions never overcome him in anything whatsoever, but who by his rational faculty, b'da'ato, and remember that this is Sefer HaMadah, which deals with Madah, and this is Da'at, which is from the same root, by his rational faculty, always has his passions under control. And he possesses a broad and sedate mind. In other words, he's a tranquil person. He's not given to being moved by great passions one way or the other, and has achieved a great breadth and depth of knowledge. So those are the two conditions that Rambam emphasizes. Now, some of these conditions are at least alluded to in the Talmud. He doesn't discuss the Gemara here. As usual, he doesn't give his sources. He does discuss the Gemara in the Guide of the Perplexed. The commentators have a little bit of a hard time because the list of conditions given is not quite the same. But I think, Rambam is basing himself to some extent on that Talmudic passage, but also on this philosophical theory that he subscribes to, which would emphasize intellectual and moral achievement. So if you don't have moral achievement and you don't have intellectual achievement, you cannot satisfy the conditions for being a prophet. Even if you do satisfy those conditions, as we'll see, God could still veto your prophecy.
Oh, so then I know so if you've achieved this, then if there are moments like when Moshe breaks the luchot, for example, and that's some kind of erratic behavior, or it's like you're swayed emotionally one way or the other.
Yes.
But he doesn't lose his prophecy.
No.
So it seems like you have to achieve it and sustain it. But
right.
If you somehow
Moshe is a very special case, as we will see.
So he's going to say that that's going to be something that's that for all of the prophets they get to keep this. But for example, when David HaMelech he has some nevuah. But
yes.
Does he lose it?
Yes.
So he loses it because Rambam's going to say because we see that he's not having any kind of muse anymore for his writing.
Right.
So that's the reason.
Yes.
He achieved it, but he lost it.
Yes. And there's another reason which we'll see, but I'll mention it already now, which is simcha, joy.
Right.
You have to be in a state of joy. And Rambam's going to say later on, based on Gemara, that the people who wanted to prophesy would play music and so on. And in the guide, he says that this is why we don't have prophecy today, because we're in a state of exile and oppression, and it's impossible for us to feel the simcha, the joy, that would go with prophecy.
So Yirmiyahu was an exception.
Yes. Right.
There are exceptions to our view.
There are a lot of exceptions. Okay, so let's go back to this. Okay, so Adam shehu mamula b'chol amidos ha'elu shalem begufo, a person who is full, it says here, abundantly endowed with these qualities, shalem begufo, and he's also perfect in his body. So that's also going to be important. Now, why is that important? Well, here's the other part of the theory of prophecy, which I haven't mentioned yet. So, the intellect, in general, deals with ideas and concepts. But the kind of pure forms that we're dealing with now seem to be, especially from an Aristotelian point of view, too much for the human mind to deal with. So, in fact, we'll see they're overwhelming for the prophets. But what happens is, the Rambam thinks, and again he's following the Arabic Aristotelians, the prophet has, in addition to a perfect intellect, a perfect imagination. The imagination is almost like a capacity to create poetry out of sensible images. So the intellect receives this pure form, but can't express it. And that overflows in turn to the imagination. And the prophet is like what we would call a poet, who is expressing these pure forms and ideas, but in this language of sensible images. So that's why you have to have a perfect body, because the imagination is part of the body. It's not just pure intellect. Again, Moshe is going to be an exception. So, Kashi Kanis the Paradise, when he enters paradise. Now remember that paradise is the term that Rambam uses based on the Gemara for the study of the esoteric subjects of metaphysics and physics, but especially metaphysics. Right? So the four who entered into paradise were the four who went into the deep philosophical matters, and then they took great risks, because you really need to be prepared for that adequately. So if such a person, having satisfied all these conditions, and now we know that they have to be intellectually perfect, ethically perfect, and physically perfect. If such a person, with the adequate curricular preparation, enters into paradise and studies the deepest philosophical matters, and continuously dwells upon these great and abstruse themes, and he'll have the right sort of mind that's capable of comprehending and grasping them. And he sanctifies himself. And he separates himself from the ways of the ordinary run of men who walk in the obscurities of the times. So that is important too, that a prophet, in order to achieve this, is going to have to separate himself from other people. And from the sorts of concerns that other people have. And he zealously trains himself, not to have a single thought of the vanities of the age and its intrigues, but rather keeping his mind disengaged, concentrated on higher things as though bound beneath the celestial throne, which is a great image. To understand those holy and pure forms. Now we get a clear indication that we're really talking about this sort of mixed Aristotelian Platonic theory, right? Because that's what the prophet really understands. And he contemplates the wisdom of God as displayed in his creatures from the first form, which would be the highest intellect, all the way down to the center of the earth. V'yodea mehen godlo, learning thence to realize God's greatness. Miyad ruach hakodesh shara alav, immediately on such a man the Holy Spirit will descend. So that's prophecy for him, and it's very much connected to being a philosopher. Not only being a philosopher, because you also have to have, in addition to intellectual perfection, ethical and physical perfection, and to delve into these matters in the proper way.
He's not getting just to the sublunar, he's going all the way back to all the...
It seems that way, because he says from the first form.
Is Ruach HaKodesh equivalent to Nevuah for him?
One could imagine making distinctions, and in the guide he has different levels, but at least here it doesn't seem as though there's any distinction that's being made.
Okay.
And I think what it means by the Holy Spirit here is the active intellect. Yeah, because then he goes on to say, and at the time when this spirit rests upon him, tisharev nafsho b'mala hamalachim hanikroim ishim. If you remember, there were ranks of angels, and the lowest ones were called ishim because they have the appearance of a human being. So that would be at the level of the active intellect, and they appear to the prophetic imagination as if a human being were speaking to them. And then this person who undergoes this becomes, as it were, another person altogether. It's a transformative experience. He understands with his mind that he's not the same as he had been. He's now elevated above the level of all the other wise men. As it says of Shaul, the king, and you shall prophesy with them and be turned into another person. So that's the basic outline of prophecy. And again, from the use of the term forms, we can see what's going on against the background of the philosophical theory. But it also requires the study of philosophy, which is why he puts in about entering into paradise, and you have to think back to what we said about that before. You have to have the proper curricular preparation, the proper rigor. You have to know logic, you have to know physics before you can delve into these matters.
You don't think that he uses the phrase acher in that way, like he becomes an ish acher because he keeps on coming back to the phrase.
That's an interesting.
He becomes an ish acher, and
right.
he does prophesize in a different
Yeah,
way.
it's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. Could be. Okay, so then let's go on to the second halacha. Hanavim malus hein. The prophets are of various degrees. Just as one sage is greater in wisdom than another, so in the gift of prophecy, one prophet is greater than another. But all of them experience prophetic manifestations only in dreams at night. Or during the day, but after a deep sleep had fallen upon them. So it's just not a waking experience, it's an overwhelming experience. It overwhelms your consciousness. You can't cope with it. So either you'd have to already be unconscious, or it would make you unconscious. It's a sort of an ecstatic experience. Shene'emar, as it says, Bamara Elav Esfada B'chalom Adaber Bo. I make myself known unto him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. V'chula and Keshem Isnabin, and all of them, when they prophesied, Evareim Mistazdin, V'kocha Guf Koshel, V'eshteno Sehem Mistrafos, V'tisha Er Hadas, Penui Lahavin Mashatira. And in the case of all of these people, again, except for Moshe, as we'll see, their limbs trembled, their physical strength failed them, their thoughts became confused, and thus the mind was left free to comprehend the vision it saw. So it's ecstatic because the intellect has to transcend the body. But now the body feels like the intellect has left, and it doesn't know it's out of control. Right? As it's said in reference to Abraham, Vehine Emoch Hashecha Gadola Nofelas Alav, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. And of Daniel, V'hodine Pacholai Lamashchis V'lo Otzarta Goa. And my comeliness was turned in me to corruption, and I retained no strength. So for all these prophets, it was totally overwhelming. Okay. Any questions about that?
Well, before that, when he said he turns into another man.
Yes.
How does that?
In other words, it's transformative. You feel like I've become a different person. I still remember everything from before, but I feel like I'm not the same anymore. I can't go on in my relationships with people. I can't be the same that I was before.
Are there such things as major and minor prophets?
Yes, definitely.
So would the minor prophets share?
Yes.
The same way as the major prophets?
Yes. Oh, would they share would they communicate?
Yes.
Okay, so later on,
said before this.
yeah. So later on he says that, you could have a prophecy that was just for you. That's possible as well. Or you could have one where you know that you're meant to communicate it to everybody. So I think, again, it's a question of overflow. Right? The general picture is that the more perfect something is, the more generosity you have in wanting to share it. So the more perfect the prophecy is, that's overflowing from the active intellect to your intellect, and from your intellect to your imagination, the more you want to share it, because that's another overflow. A less perfect prophecy would just be for you. Suppose you had a prophetic dream, you could have that, and that's the lowest level of prophecy, but maybe it's just for you. Okay, so third halacha. Hadvarim shemodiim lanovi b'mareh hanavua, derech mashal modiin lo. The matters communicated to the prophet in a prophetic vision are communicated to him in allegorical form. So what does that mean? Well, like I said, we don't have language or ideas that are adequate to express the pure forms that the prophetic mind is in touch with. So instead, there's an overflow to the imagination. And so the forms are expressed in imaginative ways. But those imaginative expressions cannot be taken literally. They're poetic, they're allegorical, so they have a deeper philosophical meaning. Right? And obviously that's connected to Rambam's view, which we saw earlier, that whenever the prophets describe God, for example, in physical terms or anything like that, you can't take that language literally. They're expressing something deep and philosophical. We would have to find the right interpretation for it.
I don't want to get too stuck on this, but I understand if you're talking about forms and sort of some deep understanding and some, physical or metaphysical way about something, whether it's God or some other thing. But when you talk, when you think of Nebuah in terms of, I will promise you this land,
right?
The Egyptians will come here, this will happen, or some other. So, is there any?
It's hard to say how that
to a form, or
how exactly that works in any detail is very hard for me to understand.
Gary.
Yes. As I say, somehow understanding the forms that underlie the created world gives some people a sense of what's going to happen in the future. And what we'll see is that in the case of Moshe, something special happens, and the ideas take a legislative form. But for many people, it's not legislative, it's this imaginative form which is meant to communicate something about the right way to live, or something like that. But how exactly the translation
relationship
works?
between form and, Greek or other
yes,
thing that we think about in terms of...
It's a problem that I don't know how to resolve. Maybe I'd have to be a prophet in order to understand it. Yes.
So the forms, can they words or they're not words?
They're not words. They go beyond language. Yes. But we have to find language. The prophet has to find language to put them in, or the prophet is given language.
To transmit that form.
Yes. And then, and then the language will have to be understood in a non-literal way. So that's what it means that it's a mashal, it's an allegory. Okay, so the prophet is told derech mashal, by way of allegory, umiyad yichakek belibo pisron ha-mashal, b'mara hanavuah v'yodamahu. But if he's a real prophet, then he's also given the interpretation at the same time as the allegory. Right, so it's different from our situation. We look at Tanakh, and we see the allegories. We have to find the interpretation. The prophet is given the allegory and the interpretation at the same time.
So it doesn't... I thought I misunderstood before that the prophet was somehow the creative that was putting, I guess, he spoke about it in terms of poetry, that the prophet was, I guess, adding his or her spin or her creativity to it in terms of the poetry. But you're saying they're given the poetry as well. Okay.
I would not say that it's creative, and that's why I have to be careful.
Well, the transmission.
Yes.
Somehow,
So I think it happens by means of the prophet's imagination. But we have a more modern romantic idea of the imagination as some sort of kind of creativity that we could control in some way. What Rambam's talking about is something that is not under the individual's control. So I do think it happens by means of the imagination, but that doesn't mean that the prophet is contributing in any personal way at all. It's an ecstatic moment that is not under the individual's control.
So they're really just a kli in some sense.
Yes, right. I think so.
And the words are what he hears, and because if he's putting it into words, she's putting it into words, and then we're listening. You're saying that when we read a text of Tanakh, right, and we're reading this Nevuah as it was given over, and we have to kind of work to understand the allegory. But that's another level, because they've already put it to words.
Mm-hmm.
So...
Well, they were given the words, right?
No, they were given something that's really not words that they turn into words.
It
and then
turns into words through them.
And then they write it down.
But it's not through their agency. I think Bilam is a great example. Right? Bilam does not have any control. He gets into this ecstatic state, and then he says what comes to him, and it may be the opposite of what he wanted to say, but it comes to him. And it comes out as this great poetry. And
so it comes out as words. That's how he formulated it. He is really just the vegetable by which all this comes out.
Right. He's the vehicle.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the way these sorts of prophets are understood.
And do they understand what they're saying?
Yes.
But
they don't control it. They understand it. So they in other words, come out with this poetic language. They also have the interpretation of it, which we would have to find. They have both. So, for example, it's different from Paro's dreams, right? Paro has a prophetic dream, but he doesn't know the interpretation. So he's not really a prophet. He has a very low level of prophecy. Right? He's not a person who's attained this intellectual and ethical perfection. Yes. So Rambam gives examples. Kamo hasulam shirao Yaakov Avinu malachim olim v'yodim bo. The ladder that Yaakov saw with the angels going up and coming down. So we know from our tradition of interpretation that this was an allegory that was really talking about the different kingdoms in history and their oppression of the people of Israel. So Yaakov understood that. So he has this vision, but he also understands what it means. Kamo hachaya shira Yechezkel v'asir nafuach u'makel shaked shira Yirmiyah. Right, it's the creatures, the chayos that Yechezkel saw, the seething cauldron and the rod of almond tree that Yirmiyahu saw, the Hamagila Shara Yechezkel, the scroll, the flying scroll that Yechezkel saw by Efa Shara Zechariah, and the measure seen by Zechariah, V'chein Shar Neviim. So these were all allegories of something, and they had the allegorical vision, which they then were able to communicate, but they also understood the meaning. Some of them had the vision, but they actually communicated the interpretation. Right? So maybe they're the ones who are saying, instead of telling you the vision, they're saying, oh, this is what's going to happen to you. Right? So maybe they have a vision of destruction or something, and then they say, if you don't do the right thing, you're going to be destroyed.
They're really describing what they had said.
Yes. And others, right, sometimes they just tell you the vision or the allegory without the interpretation. Kamiktas divrei Yechezkel, Zechariah, as Yechezkel and Zechariah but all of them prophesied in allegories and riddles. Okay. And here's the thing that I was referring to now about Simcha is the next halacha. Kol hanavim ein misnabim b'chol eis sheyirtzu. All these prophets, again with the exception of Moshe, did not prophesy whenever they pleased. Ela mechavnin da'atam. They had to concentrate their minds. V'yoshvim semechim, and they had to sit there resting, joyous, tovei lev u'misbodedim, joyous and cheerful, and in solitude. And I think it's interesting because this is also the basis. There's a lot more in between for the practice, for example, of Breslov Hasidim to go out into the woods on their own. Yeah. Right? That certain kinds of ecstatic states can only be had in solitude.
Also because there's no distraction from anything else.
Yes, exactly. So these are not social states. She'ein hanevua shara lo mitoch atzvos lo mitoch atzlos al mitoch simcha. The spirit of prophecy does not descend upon one who is melancholy or indolent, but comes as a result of joyousness. And again, there's a Gemara based on this, but he mentions the pasuk. V'zehu shene'emar v'hema misnabin. I missed out a line. Lefikach b'nei hanavim lifneihem nevel v'tof v'chalil v'chinor. And that's why the people known as the children or the sons of the prophets, and that's a term that's used, I think, 11 times in Tanakh, in Malachim Aleph and Beis, and Rambam understands it to mean they were people who wanted to be prophets. So you've got to go through the preparation. It was like a school, right? So how would they behave? Right? They would always have these musical instruments in front of them. They were seeking nevuah. They were trying to get into the right state of mind. As it says in Shmuel Aleph that they were misnabim. It doesn't say they were prophesying, but they were trying to prophesy. They were going in the way of prophecy until they would get to the point where they would actually prophesy. Like you say, somebody is growing, they're becoming great, but they're not great yet. So these people were becoming prophets, but they weren't prophets yet.
What's the point of this absolute definitions of what it means to be a Navi when there's so many Yetzim and Akal from this? I mean, what is he accomplishing here? I mean, clearly you had the whole collective Nevi'im during Midbar. They gathered together in the Olam Moed. That's where they did it. They were not alone. Yeah. And you had Yirmiyahu, of course, in a state that was not and like assuming that he doesn't always sit levad, and that's the implication there. And there's great sadness and destruction around, and so does Daniel have it, and so does Yechezkel has it. Says in certain stages of Yeshayahu, one could argue he's a happy guy, but like ultimately.
So those
the
were
known prophets. A lot of this doesn't apply. So what is
those were people who had to be able to achieve tranquility of mind, even in a state of exile and so on. But in the case of Dor HaMidbar, I don't think he considers them to be collectively prophets. Remember that the way Rambam understands the 10 Commandments, right? The first 2 commandments were given directly to the people, not by means of Moshe. What does that mean? Rambam said they understood it by means of their intellect. In other words, they understood how to prove that God exists. Well, that's not exactly prophecy in our sense, right? That means grasping the rational basis for divine existence.
So when Yirmiyahu says, fine, let's leave the grouping.
Yeah.
When Yirmiyahu says, right? He says those things.
Yes.
Or Moshe might be different, but when they say Echasa, or you have others who kvetch about the state of affairs. You're saying that they are for Rambam, they are in some kind of ecstatic state of simcha, and there's music pouring around them that they could. Right. I mean, he can't discount the well-known prophets, and
I think you're making a good point. But he somehow has to fit that in with his account. And again, remember that is based on a Gemara as well. This line about Simcha and yeah.
But I don't see Chazal putting it in an absolute light.
Right.
It's that one can attain nevuah in that, the way I understand the Gemara, one can attain nevuah in that state, but it's not. These are the ingredients for nevuah to be able to take place for it. But he gets away with it.
Yeah. So, and then in Halacha 5, he says, Elu, that means the B'nai Nevi'im, right? Elu shehem mevakshin le'esnabe, those who sought the prophetic gift. Heim hanikroim B'nai HaNevi'im, those are called the sons of the prophets. For afal pisha mekavnin daitom, and even though they did concentrate their minds, efsha shetishra shchina aleihen ve'efsha shelo tishra. It was possible to go either way. And this is where you see an indication of Rambam's account in the guide, which I mentioned before, which is that even if you satisfied all the conditions, God has a veto. And to that extent, it's not an entirely natural process. Right? If it were a natural process, you would satisfy the conditions and then it would happen automatically. But that's not the way it is. And I should mention also that in the Shmona Prakim, in the 8 chapters that Rambam uses as an introduction to Pirkei Avos, to the ethics of the fathers, he really treats ethics as a training for prophecy. He says very clearly in his introduction that we should all be preparing for prophecy. So we should try to go through these steps, even though we may not reach the end point. Nevertheless, we have to achieve ethical perfection, which is through halacha, but also through a careful understanding of the way halacha works, intellectual perfection through the study of the sciences and philosophy, with the goal in mind of achieving prophecy. So he says that Pirkei Avos is preparation for prophecy. That's the way he thinks about it. So I guess we should also learn music in that case, so that we can all play the instruments in our solitude and have the right state of simcha. Although, as I say, he says in the guide that our current state of political oppression is such that that's not really attainable for us. After the Rambam's time, there was a very famous case of Avraham Abulafia, great reader of Rambam and also a Kabbalist, who claimed to be a prophet. So he began the tradition of prophetic Kabbalah because he felt that you could really attain prophecy. And the Rashbam, Shlomo ibn Adret, and other rabbinic authorities were not very keen on this idea. But there are some tshuvas, some responses about this, about whether this person did achieve the level of prophecy.
So Rambam, I used to think the Rambam thought that he himself was a prophet, but I guess
Yes.
if he claims that nowadays you can't be a prophet, maybe it was something
Right.
that he tried and didn't get. Is that a bit? Or
Yes.
did he think? Or did he think
There is an
he was
article by Abraham Joshua Heschel called "Did the Rambam Believe Himself to be a Prophet?" And the answer that he gives to that is a rather reluctant answer, but he says ultimately no. But clearly Rambam was very attracted to this notion and felt that it was the proper goal of human life, but it wasn't something that was within our reach for two reasons. One, because of our state of oppression, and the other because even if you did satisfy the conditions, you still wouldn't be guaranteed to.
It seems like
to
you'd be
attain
too
prophecy.
busy, too involved in
Yes.
other.
This doesn't seem happy.
Well, but at the very end of the guide, he envisages, and this had a huge impact on the history of Judaism, a state of dveikus, of cleaving to the active intellect to such an extent that you wouldn't need to be isolated anymore. In other words, the true prophet could attain this and not be distracted even within everyday life. Right? Rambam says you could even be talking to your spouse and your children and going about your daily business and still be in tune with the active intellect. That's the very highest level. And that became the influence on the notion of dveikus within Kabbalah and Hasidus as well. So it's very much like Plato's Republic, the idea of the cave. So here we are within the cave, we see the sensible things, but not the ideas behind them. The philosopher manages to get out of the cave and sees the ideas and even the sun from which they come, which would be the intellect, but then returns to the cave, right, to liberate all those other people with the message that he has learnt. And the prophet, from Rambam's point of view, of the highest level, will be able to go back into the cave of everyday life and still retain that connection to the vision. And that's what Moshe does. But even for Moshe, as we'll see, but I'm not going to read it out because I think we'll stop. Even Moshe has to separate from his wife, and from certain aspects of physical life, he's capable of not eating for 40 days and 40 nights. And he no longer has relations with his wife. So he's not fully of this world anymore, which is why he has this light shining from him and so on.
Right, but then Miriam and Aaron,
Yes.
and the response is, he's not a Navi like you are.
Right.
Right? You are not a Navi.
Yes.
Like there's nothing, you have Nevuah, but you're not, so he's a Navi of a different kind. So is Rambam talking about the Navi like the ultimate kind, or the regular Joe Schmo Navi? That it seems like this is the regular Joe Schmo Navi, and then Moshe has a totally different experience. Is that the ultimate Navi?
Moshe is the ultimate Navi.
But no one attains that.
Except him.
Is that the Nevuah that Rambam is trying to attain, or is he trying to attain a Nevuah of the basic Joe Schmo Navi?
That's a good question, but I would say that he's trying to attain the basic level of prophecy. Because the problem is, again, if you have a law-based religion, then Rambam thinks there has to be an ultimate prophet, and obviously there's a certain similarity to Islam here as well. There has to be an ultimate prophet in terms of the law, because otherwise you're going to have a law here and then it's going to be overturned, and who knows, right?
What?
I said according to Yigdal, no.
Right.
Does that thing come up there?
So that's the point. So Moshe is the only legislative Navi. There can be other Nevi'im after Moshe, but they're not going to be legislative in the same way. So Moshe has a purely intellectual understanding of the basic forms and is able to tell people how they should act. And that's different from a certain vision of an allegorical vision that you might have about what's going to happen in the future or something like that.
That's very helpful with the comparisons of other Nevi'im, like Moshe, like Eliyahu, for example.
Yes.
Because he does have that kind of telling the people how they should act in some way.
Yes.
Like he can come back down, or maybe he's not.
Yeah. But it's not legislative.
It's not legislative, right?
Right. So what the Rambam's view of the human condition is that we humans are very peculiar hybrids, right? All things down here are made of form and matter. But our fundamental form is the intellect. The intellect is capable of separating from matter. Other forms are not. The form of a whale cannot separate from the body of a whale. But the intellectual form of a human being can in principle separate. And that also creates a problem of governance. Does the body and its desires control our lives, or does the intellect control the desires? And Rambam's view is that we cannot solve that problem on our own. Human intellect on its own is not strong enough, and it's easily overpowered by the desires and the imagination. What we need is a law from outside, from pure intellect, that isn't embodied in the body. And that's why only someone like Moshe, who rises to this very pure level beyond the body, almost like he's not embodied anymore, it's almost like he's an angel, but he still understands the human condition. Only such a person can be capable of expressing the law that by means of which human beings can govern themselves and have a society that can govern itself in an adequate way. And I'll stop there.
Okay.